The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in hues of amber and gold, its rays stretching across the endless horizon like molten copper. Inside, the Desert Rose Diner time moved with the languid pace of honey dripping from a spoon. The scent of coffee and bacon perfumed the air and mingling with the faint aroma of desert dust that seemed permanently embedded in the wooden floorboards. Maggie Collins wiped down the counter with practiced efficiency, her movements as familiar as breathing, after 15 years at the same Formica surface. At 45, her face carried the gentle weathering of a life fully lived, laugh lines, framing eyes that had seen both joy and sorrow in equal measure. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, a few strands escaping to frame her face. The desert rose had been her sanctuary, her prison, and her salvation all at once, since that day 12 years ago, when her world had shattered beyond recognition. The morning crowd was sparse but predictable. Old Bill Jenkins nursing his third coffee while pretending to read yesterday's newspaper. The Henderson couple, silently sharing a plate of pancakes, communicating in the shorthand of 40 years of marriage. Two truckers planning routes over eggs and toast, the familiar rhythm of another ordinary day. But Maggie knew better than most how quickly ordinary could transform into extraordinary. How life could change course in a heartbeat. The weight of her past hung around her neck like the military medal she kept hidden in her wallet, a talisman of a life she had tried to leave behind. The distant rumble came first, felt more than heard. A deep vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Old Bill's coffee cup trembled slightly, sending ripples across the dark surface. The truckers paused mid-conversation, their weathered faces turning toward the large windows that faced the highway. The sound grew louder, transforming from a rumble to a roar, the unmistakable symphony of multiple Harley-Davidson engines working in perfect harmony. Iron Legion, one of the truckers, muttered, his voice a mixture of respect and wariness. Maggie felt her heart quicken, an old reflex she had never quite managed to extinguish. Her eyes flicked momentarily to her left ring finger, where a thin white line still marked the absence of the wedding band she had stopped wearing 5 years ago. Some ghost refused to be exorcised completely. The motorcycles appeared on the horizon like a steel cavalry sunlight glinting off chrome and polished metal. 15 riders in perfect formation, their leather cuts emblazoned with the Iron Legion insignia, a skull wearing a combat helmet set against the backdrop of American flag wings. They pulled into the parking lot with military precision, engines growling, before falling silent in unison. The diner fell quiet, conversations suspended in the sudden vacuum of anticipation. Maggie drew a deep breath, steadying herself. Just another group of customers. Nothing more. The mantra she repeated silently didn't quite convince her racing heart. The man who entered first filled the doorway with his presence. Jack Steele Harrington stood 6'3", his frame solid and imposing despite his 58 years. His silver hair was cut short in military fashion, his face weathered by sun and wind, and time-deep lines carved around eyes that had seen more than their share of both beauty and horror. His leather cut bore additional patches marking him as the president of the Iron Legion MC, Southwest Chapter. Behind him filed in his brothers, 14 men of varying ages but similar bearing, all carrying the unmistakable posture of those who had served. No one in the Desert Rose Diner could have predicted that within 20 minutes, one woman's decision would determine whether this imposing man lived, stickate, or faced a fate many would consider worse than death itself. The Iron Legion took over the large corner booth and two adjacent tables, arranging themselves with the instinctual hierarchy of a wolf pack. Jack sat at the center, his lieutenant Frank Bones Miller to his right. Bones was leaner than Jack, but no less formidable, his face dominated by a salt and pepper mustache and eyes that missed nothing. At 55, he moved with the coiled readiness of a man 20 years younger, his hands scarred and powerful. Maggie approached their table order pad in hand, her professional smile firmly in place. "Welcome to the Desert Rose, gentlemen. Coffee to start." Jack looked up, his steel blue eyes meeting hers briefly. Maggie felt a flicker of something strange pass between them, a momentary connection she couldn't explain. He nodded once, a small gesture that nonetheless carried authority. "Black for all of us, ma'am." She noticed something then so subtle most would miss it. A slight asymmetry to his smile. The right side of his mouth didn't quite match the left. A faint sheen of sweat beaded his forehead despite the diner's air conditioning. His right hand rested on the table, fingers splayed slightly wider than seemed natural. Maggie turned toward the counter, her mind suddenly in overdrive. The professional smile remained fixed on her face, betraying nothing of the alarm bells now ringing in her head. Behind the counter, she poured 16 cups of coffee with practiced efficiency while her thoughts raced through possibilities, probabilities, and memories she had locked away years ago. Face, arms, speech, time. The fast protocol for recognizing stroke symptoms flashed in her mind, medical training resurfacing like a submarine emerging from the depths. She had seen the facial asymmetry. The unusual hand posture suggested potential weakness. She needed to check his speech and determine when symptoms began. As she delivered the coffee, Maggie observed Jack with renewed intensity, her eyes noting every detail with clinical precision. The Legion members were engaged in conversation about their memorial ride, planning their route to honor fallen brothers. Jack remained mostly silent, nodding occasionally. When he did speak, Maggie detected a subtle slurring, barely perceptible but unmistakable to her trained ear. "Ready to order?" she asked, making direct eye contact with Jack, watching his responses carefully. Bones answered instead. "Full breakfast and all around. Eggs over easy bacon, crisp toast." Jack attempted to add something, his voice slightly thick. "Extra butter on the—" He paused, seemingly struggling to find the word. His right hand twitched slightly on the table. "Toast," Maggie supplied gently. Jack nodded, a flash of confusion crossing his features before being replaced by a mask of stoicism. No one else at the table seemed to notice anything amiss, but Maggie knew. Every second that passed was another moment of oxygen deprivation to his brain. Time was brain. The mantra from her emergency medicine days echoed in her mind. She returned to the kitchen to place their order, her thoughts in turmoil. The symptoms were clear enough to her, but intervening meant confronting a group of motorcycle club members about their president's vulnerability. She knew how men like these valued strength, how admission of weakness was anathema to their code. More importantly, she knew how pride could kill faster than any disease. Through the kitchen window, she watched Jack attempt to lift his coffee cup. His movements were slightly uncoordinated, the cup wobbling almost imperceptibly. No one at his table noticed, engaged as they were in conversation. Maggie closed her eyes briefly, remembering another moment 12 years ago when hesitation had cost everything. The memory rose, unbidden, sharp and clear, despite the passage of time. Her husband Tom in his Navy uniform standing by his motorcycle, promising to be careful on his ride back to base. The phone call 3 hours later. The chaplain's solemn voice. The closed casket funeral. The crushing weight of "if only" that had nearly suffocated her. Maggie touched the small pocket in her apron where she kept her wallet, feeling the outline of Tom's metal through the fabric. She had made a promise at his grave when she had failed to keep when fear and grief overwhelmed her. She had abandoned her calling as a nurse, retreating to the relative safety of the diner. But now, watching Jack struggle while his brothers remained oblivious, she felt that promise stir back to life. When she returned with their food 10 minutes later, the situation had deteriorated. Jack's coffee remained untouched, and the right side of his face had begun to droop more noticeably. His breathing had changed, becoming slightly labored. Maggie placed the plates on the table, her decision made. "Sir," she addressed Jack directly, keeping her voice low and steady. "Are you feeling all right?" Bones answered before Jack could respond. "He's fine, just tired from the long ride." Jack attempted to speak, but the words emerged garbled. A flash of fear crossed his eyes there, and gone in an instant, but Maggie caught it. She recognized the moment of realization, the terrifying understanding that something was very wrong with your own body. "I think he needs medical attention," Maggie said firmly, no longer asking, but stating. The atmosphere at the table changed instantly, tension crackling like static electricity. The younger members looked confused, while the older ones closed ranks, their postures shifting subtly toward their president. "He said he's fine," Bones repeated, his voice hardening. "Mind your own business, lady." Maggie stood her ground, meeting his gaze without flinching. "With all due respect, sir, he's not fine. He's showing classic signs of a stroke, and every minute we waste arguing could mean permanent brain damage or death." The word "death" fell like a stone into still water, ripples of shock spreading across the table. Jack tried to stand, then perhaps to prove his strength, but his right leg buckled beneath him. He would have crashed to the floor if Bones hadn't caught him, alarm finally breaking through his stoic exterior. "Jack." Bones eased him back into the seat, his hands gripping his president's shoulders. The other Legion members rose halfway from their seats, uncertain and suddenly afraid. Call 911, Maggie commanded, her voice transformed from friendly waitress to emergency responder in an instant. She moved around the table to Jack's side, her movements precise and confident. Help me lay him down on the bench. Bones hesitated, torn between pride and fear. We take care of our own. Maggie looked him directly in the eyes, her voice steady but urgent. I was an emergency trauma nurse for 15 years before working here. Your friend is having an ischemic stroke. We have roughly 45 minutes from onset to get him treatment before permanent damage occurs. Now you can either help me save him, or you can stand there and watch him die. Your choice. Something in her tone, the absolute certainty of her knowledge, penetrated Bones's resistance. He nodded once, helping her ease Jack into a supine position on the booth bench. The other patrons watched in stunned silence as Maggie began checking Jack's vital signs with practiced efficiency. How long has he been off? She asked Bones as she gently turned Jack's head to maintain his airway. Started acting strange about an hour back during our last rest stop, one of the younger riders volunteered. Thought he was just tired or dehydrated. Maggie calculated quickly. An hour since symptoms began meant they were still within the crucial treatment window, but barely. Someone call 911. Tell them suspected ischemic stroke male patient 58 symptoms began approximately 1 hour ago. As the youngest rider pulled out his phone, Jack's condition suddenly worsened. His breathing became more labored and his eyes rolled back slightly. Maggie recognized the signs of decreasing consciousness and knew they were running out of time. Help me get him onto the floor, she instructed Bones and another rider. Carefully support his head and neck. They complied, their movements surprisingly gentle for such imposing men. As they lowered Jack to the floor, his wallet fell from his jacket pocket, its contents spilling across the linoleum. Among them was a small photograph worn at the edges from frequent handling. Maggie caught a glimpse of a woman with a warm smile, perhaps Jack's late wife. But it was another item that froze her in place momentarily. A military medal identical to the one she carried in her own wallet. The Navy SEAL trident that Tom had earned that had been presented to her at his funeral with solemn ceremony. Shock rippled through her, but professional training took precedence. She would process the implications later. Right now, Jack needed her complete focus. Loosen his collar and belt, she instructed as she checked his pulse. It was rapid but strong. Anyone know if he's on blood thinners or has any medical conditions? High blood pressure. Bones supplied, his gruff demeanor giving way to genuine concern. Takes medication for it. No blood thinners that I know of. Maggie nodded, filing away the information. Any allergies to medications? None listed on his medical alert card, Bones said, pulling a card from his own wallet. We all carry them. Military habit. The confirmation of Jack's military background added another layer to the emerging picture, but Maggie remained focused on the immediate crisis. She continued monitoring his vital signs, ensuring his airway remained clear, speaking to him in calm, clear tones, even though she wasn't sure he could hear her. Jack, you're having a stroke. Help is on the way. Stay with us. The distant wail of sirens announced the approaching ambulance, and Maggie felt a momentary flood of relief. But she knew they weren't out of danger yet, not by a long shot. The Iron Legion members had formed a protective circle around their fallen leader, their faces masks of worry and helpless anger. Maggie recognized the expression all too well, the rage that came when powerful men confronted a situation they couldn't control through strength or will. The paramedics will need space, she told them, her voice gentle but firm. And they'll need to know exactly when his symptoms started and what medications he takes. Bones nodded, designating 2 members to move the tables, creating access for the emergency responders. The efficiency of their response spoke to their military backgrounds, crisis cutting through their initial resistance. The paramedics arrived in a flurry of activity, their uniforms and equipment bringing a sense of order to the chaos. Maggie immediately began relaying information to them, her medical terminology flowing naturally after years of disuse. Male patient 58 presenting with left-sided facial drooping, right-sided weakness and speech difficulties, consistent with acute ischemic stroke. Symptoms began approximately 65 minutes ago. History of hypertension on medication. The lead paramedic, a woman in her 30s with efficient movements, nodded as she attached monitoring equipment to Jack. You medical, former emergency trauma nurse, 15 years experience, Maggie confirmed. The second paramedic, a younger man, was preparing the gurney. BP 190, 110, pulse 95, and irregular oxygen sat 94%. We need to move fast, the female paramedic said. County hospital is 30 minutes out with lights and sirens. Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. 30 minutes transit time, plus the hours since symptom onset would put them dangerously close to the end of the treatment window. And County Hospital wasn't the best equipped for stroke cases. Desert Valley Medical Center has a specialized stroke unit, she suggested. Better facilities for this type of case. The female paramedic shook her head. That's on the other side of Devil's Backbone Pass. Would add another 20 minutes minimum. Bones, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. What are his chances at County versus this other place? The paramedic hesitated, professional caution warring with honesty. County can administer TPA if he qualifies, but they don't have neurosurgery on site if complications arise. Desert Valley has a comprehensive stroke center with neurosurgery available 24/7. Bones looked at Maggie, a silent question in his eyes. Time is brain, she said quietly. Every minute without treatment means more damage, but quality of care matters too. The decision hung in the air between them, weighted with implications. Finally, Bones nodded. Desert Valley. The paramedics exchanged a glance, then nodded. We'll call ahead, let them know we're coming in hot. As they prepared to move Jack onto the gurney, his hand suddenly reached out, gripping Maggie's wrist with surprising strength. His eyes, clouded with fear and confusion, locked onto hers. He tried to speak the words, slurred beyond recognition, but the desperation in his gaze was unmistakable. I'll ride with you, she found herself saying, the words emerging before conscious thought. She looked to the paramedics. If that's okay. The female paramedic nodded, recognizing the value of Maggie's experience. Could use the extra hands. Bones stepped forward again. We'll follow on our bikes, clear the way if needed. The manager of the Desert Rose appeared at Maggie's shoulder, concern etched on his face. Maggie, your shift. I'm going with them, Dave, she said with quiet certainty. Cover for me. Dave nodded without hesitation. Go. Do what you need to do. As the paramedics lifted the gurney, Jack's wallet remained on the floor where it had fallen. Maggie quickly gathered its contents, her fingers lingering momentarily on the Navy SEAL trident that mirrored the one she carried. She slipped the wallet into her pocket alongside her own two pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed suddenly in proximity. Outside, the ambulance doors swung open, ready to receive their critical patient. The Iron Legion members stood in a solemn line, their faces grim with worry for their fallen leader. As Jack was loaded into the ambulance, Maggie felt the weight of their gazes on her, measuring, assessing, hoping. Bones approached her before she could climb into the ambulance. His voice was low, meant for her ears alone. You know what that medal means. Maggie nodded, her throat tight with emotion she couldn't yet process. My husband had one just like it. Something shifted in Bones's eyes, recognition dawning. Tom Collins. The sound of her husband's name from this stranger's lips sent a shock through Maggie's system. You knew Tom. We served together. Jack was our commanding officer. Bones's voice held wonder and confusion in equal measure. Jack was with him when... The paramedic called from inside the ambulance, urgency in her voice. We need to move now. Go, Bones said, stepping back. We'll be right behind you. Maggie climbed into the ambulance, her world tilting on its axis. As the doors closed and the siren wailed to life, she looked down at Jack Harrington, seeing him with new eyes. This man had been with Tom in his final moments. This man might hold answers to questions she had carried for 12 long years. But first she had to help save his life. The ambulance screamed through traffic lights, flashing and siren wailing, a desperate plea for passage. Inside, Maggie assisted the paramedics as they worked to stabilize Jack, her hands moving with muscle memory that transcended time. She inserted an IV line while the female paramedic, whose name tag read Rodriguez, administered medication to lower Jack's dangerously high blood pressure. BP's coming down, Rodriguez noted with approval. You've still got the touch. Maggie managed a tight smile, her focus entirely on the patient. Jack's condition had stabilized somewhat, but his right side remained largely immobile, and his attempts at speech were unintelligible. The clock continued its relentless countdown, each minute potentially representing millions of dying brain cells. Through the rear windows, Maggie could see the Iron Legion following in tight formation, their motorcycles forming a protective escort around the ambulance. The road ahead would take them through Devil's Backbone Pass, a treacherous stretch of highway that wound through the mountains like a serpent. Under normal circumstances, it was a challenging drive. Under emergency conditions, it would test the skill of even the most experienced driver. As if reading her thoughts, the young male paramedic called back from the driver's seat. Coming up on the pass in 2 minutes, might get bumpy. Rodriguez secured the equipment, checking Jack's restraints to ensure he wouldn't be jostled during the difficult passage. Maggie found herself reaching for Jack's hand, providing human connection amidst the clinical chaos. His fingers twitched slightly in response, a small but significant sign that he remained present despite his condition. "Jack," she said, leaning close so he could hear her over the siren, "we're taking you to Desert Valley, best stroke center in the region. You're going to get through this." His eyes found hers, fear and confusion giving way momentarily to something else. Recognition, understanding. Maggie couldn't be sure, but she maintained eye contact, offering whatever comfort she could in this moment of extreme vulnerability. The ambulance began its ascent into Devil's Backbone Pass, the smooth highway giving way to twisting curves that hugged the mountainside. Through the windows, Maggie caught glimpses of the breathtaking Arizona landscape. Red rock formations set against the azure sky beauty that belied the life and death drama unfolding within the ambulance. As they navigated a particularly sharp turn, Jack's monitors began to alarm. His blood pressure was spiking dangerously, again the stress of the situation exacerbating his condition. "Push another 10 of labetalol," Rodriguez ordered, her voice calm but urgent. Maggie complied immediately, her movements precise despite the swaying of the ambulance. As she administered the medication, Jack's eyes locked onto hers, again a desperate message in their depths. He was trying to communicate something, fighting against the paralysis that had seized half his body. "Save your strength," she told him gently. "You can tell me later." But he persisted, his left hand reaching toward his chest with clear intent. Maggie realized he was trying to indicate something. She patted his chest gently, feeling the outline of an inner pocket in his leather cut. "Something in your pocket?" she asked. He blinked once definitively. "Yes." With careful movements, Maggie reached into the inner pocket of his leather vest. Her fingers encountered a folded piece of paper, worn soft with age and handling. She withdrew it partially enough to see that it was a letter, the name Ben, visible at the top in a strong masculine hand. "A letter to Ben?" she asked. Another blink. "Yes." "Your son," she guessed. The pain that flashed across Jack's face told her she was correct and that there was a story there, a complicated one. "I'll make sure he gets it," she promised, tucking the letter back into his pocket. "But you're going to have the chance to give it to him yourself." Jack's eyes held hers, doubt warring with hope. In that moment, the connection between them transcended their strange, sudden circumstances. Two people bound by invisible threads of past tragedy and present crisis, finding unexpected understanding in the back of a speeding ambulance. The vehicle lurched suddenly as the driver navigated another sharp curve, bringing Maggie back to the immediate reality. They were halfway through the pass now, the road ahead slightly more forgiving. The Iron Legion continued their escort, a steel honor guard guiding their president through the gauntlet. Rodriguez checked Jack's vitals again, her expression cautiously optimistic. "He's holding steady. BP's responding to medication." Maggie nodded, allowing herself a small moment of hope. If they could get Jack to Desert Valley within the treatment window, if he qualified for the clot-busting drugs, if there were no complications. So many ifs, but each one represented a chance that hadn't existed an hour ago when she first recognized the signs of stroke in the Desert Rose Diner. 10 minutes to Desert Valley," called the driver. 10 minutes that would determine whether Jack Harrington recovered, survived with disability, or became another tragic statistic. 10 minutes that had brought Maggie Collins full circle back to the profession she had abandoned, confronting echoes of the past she had tried to outrun. As the ambulance emerged from Devil's Backbone Pass, the valley opened before them, sunlight glinting off the glass and steel of Desert Valley Medical Center in the distance. The Iron Legion riders, having successfully navigated the treacherous mountain road, pulled ahead of the ambulance to clear the way through the final stretch of highway. In the momentary quiet that followed, Maggie found herself wondering what Tom would think of this strange turn of events. Her husband, who had lived and died by a code of brotherhood and service, would understand her actions today without explanation. He would recognize in Jack Harrington a kindred spirit, a man who had dedicated his life to the same principles. The irony wasn't lost on her. 12 years after failing to save her husband, fate had placed her in position to potentially save his commanding officer. Second chances rarely announce themselves so dramatically, yet here she was being offered exactly that. Jack's monitor beeped again, drawing her attention back to the present. His oxygen levels were dropping slightly, a concerning development. Maggie adjusted his oxygen flow and positioning her movements automatic after years of training. She spoke to him continuously, her voice a lifeline to consciousness. Almost there, Jack. Desert Valley is just ahead. Best stroke team in the state. Just stay with us a little longer. His eyes remained fixed on hers, determination visible despite the paralysis affecting half his face. In that gaze, Maggie recognized the same indomitable will that had characterized the Navy SEALs she had known through Tom. Men who refused to quit, who pushed beyond normal human limitations through sheer force of will. The ambulance siren changed pitch as they approached the medical center, the driver alerting the emergency department of their imminent arrival. Rodriguez made a final check of Jack's vitals, ensuring everything was documented for the handoff to the hospital team. You did good work here, she told Maggie quietly. Most people would have minded their own business. Most waitresses wouldn't recognize stroke symptoms if they saw them. Maggie shook her head slightly. I should have recognized them sooner. You saw what his brothers missed, Rodriguez countered. That's what matters. The ambulance pulled into the emergency bay of Desert Valley Medical Center, where a stroke response team waited with practice readiness. As the doors swung open, Maggie felt the familiar rush of hospital air, antiseptic and purpose combined. For a moment, 12 years fell away, and she was back in her element, the place where she had once felt most alive and useful. The handoff was swift and efficient, Rodriguez delivering a concise report to the attending physician while the team transferred Jack to a hospital gurney. Maggie stepped back, suddenly aware of her diner uniform, the incongruity of her presence in this medical setting. One of the neurologists, a woman with silver-streaked dark hair, glanced at her curiously. You came in with the patient. I recognized the stroke symptoms at my diner, Maggie explained. I'm a former emergency nurse. The neurologist nodded, professional respect in her eyes. Good catch. We'll take it from here. As they wheeled Jack away, his eyes sought Maggie's one last time. In that brief moment, something passed between them, an understanding that transcended words. A promise made and acknowledged. Outside the emergency department doors, the Iron Legion had arrived, parking their motorcycles in a neat row. Bones approached Maggie, his face a mask of contained worry. How is he? He asked without preamble. Stable for now, she answered honestly. They'll do scans to confirm the stroke and determine if he's eligible for clot-busting medication. Bones nodded, processing the information with military stoicism. Then his gaze sharpened, focusing on Maggie with new intensity. You said your husband had a trident. Was he Tom Collins' Echo team? The question hung in the air between them, laden with implications. Maggie felt her heart skip a beat, the past and present colliding with unexpected force. Yes, she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. Lieutenant Thomas Collins. He died 12 years ago in a motorcycle accident on his way back to base. Recognition dawned in Bones's weathered face, followed by something that looked remarkably like awe. My God. You're Tom's Maggie. The possessive stung and soothed simultaneously, a reminder of a time when she had indeed been Tom's Maggie, with pride and joy. Jack was with him. Bones continued, his voice rough with emotion. He was first on the scene. Tried to save him, but the words trailed off, unnecessary in their painful conclusion. Maggie felt the world tilt slightly, the ground beneath her feet suddenly less stable. All these years she had imagined Tom's final moments alone on some anonymous stretch of highway. The knowledge that someone had been there, that Tom hadn't died without human comfort, hit her with unexpected force. He never forgave himself, Bones said quietly. Jack, carried that weight for 12 years. Before Maggie could process this revelation, the hospital doors opened again. The silver-haired neurologist emerged, her face serious but not grim. Family of Jack Harrington, she inquired, looking at the assembled Legion members. Bones stepped forward. We're his brothers, not by blood, but in every way that matters. The neurologist nodded, accepting this without question. Mr. Harrington has suffered an ischemic stroke, a blood clot blocking flow to his brain. We're preparing to administer TPA, a medication that can break up the clot, but there are risks involved. We need consent from next of kin or someone with medical power of attorney. Bones looked stricken. His son Ben is his only blood family, but they haven't spoken in years. I don't know if anyone has medical power. I do, said one of the older Legion members stepping forward. Jack made me his medical proxy after Linda died. He said there was no one else he trusted more. The neurologist nodded. I'll need to speak with you about the risks and benefits of treatment. As they moved away to discuss Jack's treatment options, Maggie found herself standing alone adrift in a sea of implications and connections she was only beginning to understand. The letter in Jack's pocket to a son he was estranged from, the medal that linked him to Tom, the weight of guilt Bones had described. One of the younger Legion members approached her tentatively, offering a leather jacket. Thought you might be cold, ma'am. Hospital air conditioning and all. The simple kindness broke through her momentary paralysis. She accepted the jacket with a grateful smile, slipping it over her diner uniform. The weight of it was comforting substantial. Thank you, she said. I'm Maggie Collins. Jake Reynolds, he replied, his youthful face serious beneath a carefully maintained beard. They call me Rookie. How long have you been with the Legion, Jake? Just a year, he admitted. I was Army, not Navy, like most of these guys. Jack gave me a chance when I came home and had nowhere to go. Maggie nodded, understanding dawning. The Iron Legion wasn't just a motorcycle club. It was a lifeline for veterans struggling to find their place in civilian life, a brotherhood that extended beyond service years. Jack Harrington had created something vital and necessary, and now his life hung in the balance, the fate of the Legion uncertain along with its founder. He's going to make it, Jake said with the absolute conviction of youth. Jack's too stubborn to check out like this. Maggie wished she could share his certainty. She had seen too many strong people felled by the indiscriminate cruelty of stroke, their strength counting for nothing against blocked blood vessels and oxygen-starved brain tissue. But she nodded anyway, offering what comfort she could. The fact that we recognized it quickly gives him better odds, she said, the nurse in her providing factual hope rather than false promises. The hospital doors opened again, and the older Legion member who was Jack's medical proxy emerged with the neurologist. His face was grave but resolved. They're giving him the TP, he announced to the waiting brothers. Doc says his chances are good, caught it in time. A collective exhalation passed through the group, tension releasing fractionally. Maggie felt her own shoulders relax slightly. They had made it within the treatment window. Jack had a fighting chance. The next hours would determine how complete his recovery might be, what functions might be lost or preserved. But he would live. And in that continued life lay possibilities that extended beyond Jack himself, touching all those connected to him, including now Maggie Collins. As the Legion members settled in for the long wait, Bones approached Maggie again. You saved our president today. The Legion doesn't forget its debts. Maggie shook her head. I just did what anyone with my training would do. Bones' expression suggested he knew better. You did what his brother should have noticed but didn't, and you did it knowing we might not take kindly to the interference. That took courage. He hesitated, then asked the question that hung between them. Will you stay? There's something about Jack and your husband I think you should know. Something Jack would want you to hear. Maggie thought of the diner, her afternoon shift, the normal life she had constructed so carefully from the ruins of tragedy. Then she thought of the letter in Jack's pocket, addressed to a son he no longer spoke to, of Tom's medal carried by this man who had apparently been with her husband in his final moments. Some questions had waited 12 years for answers. Some connections, once revealed, couldn't be ignored. I'll stay, she said simply. Behind them, the sun continued its arc across the Arizona sky, casting long shadows across the hospital parking lot. The motorcycles of the Iron Legion gleamed in the afternoon light, silent sentinels awaiting their rider's return. Inside, Jack Harrington fought his most important battle, unaware of the strange confluence of past and present that had brought Maggie Collins into his life at precisely the moment he needed her most. Second chances rarely announced themselves dramatically, but sometimes fate intervened with unmistakable clarity. For Maggie, standing among these leathered warriors outside Desert Valley Medical Center, the message couldn't have been clearer if it had been written across the sky. This was where she needed to be. This was what she needed to do. And whatever came next would forever alter the careful boundaries she had drawn around her life since losing Tom. The question was whether she was ready to embrace that change, or if fear would once again drive her back to the safety of routine and resignation. As if in answer, her hand found Tom's medal in her wallet, the metal warm from proximity to her body. 12 years ago, she had made a promise at his grave. Today, she had begun to fulfill it. The waiting room of Desert Valley Medical Center existed in a different dimension of time, where seconds stretched into hours and minutes condensed into heartbeats. Maggie sat among the Iron Legion members, a solitary figure in a diner uniform amid a sea of leather cuts and weathered faces. The fluorescent lights cast everyone in the same unflattering pallor, stripping away pretense and leaving only raw humanity. 2 hours had passed since Jack Harrington had been wheeled through the double doors, his fate now in the hands of neurologists and stroke specialists. 2 hours of coffee from vending machines, uncomfortable plastic chairs, and the peculiar solidarity that forms between strangers, united by shared concern. Frank Bones Miller paced the floor, his boots making soft thuds against the linoleum. 7 steps one way, turn, 7 steps back. A military habit. Maggie recognized the measured movements of a man accustomed to waiting under pressure. The younger members watched him taking cues from his controlled demeanor, while the older ones sat in stoic silence, their stillness, its own form of vigilance. Maggie's mind kept returning to the revelation that Jack had been with Tom in his final moments. All these years she had imagined her husband dying alone on some anonymous stretch of highway, the thought a silent torment she had never fully escaped. The knowledge that someone had been there, had tried to save him, should have brought comfort. Instead, it opened wounds she had convinced herself had scarred over. Miss Collins. The voice startled her from her thoughts. Bones had stopped his pacing and now stood before her, 2 cups of vending machine coffee in his weathered hands. He offered one to her, a peace offering of sorts. "Thank you," she said, accepting the cup more for the warmth than the questionable coffee inside. Bones lowered himself into the chair beside her, his movements betraying the stiffness of old injuries. For a moment they sat in silence, the universal language of hospital waiting rooms. "Jack would want you to know," Bones finally said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "About Tom, I mean." Maggie's hands tightened around the coffee cup, the heat almost painful against her palms. "What happened?" The official report said single vehicle accident, loss of control on a curve. Bones nodded slowly. That's what it looked like, what it was technically. But there was more to it. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts, to choose his words with military precision. "Tom was heading back to base after visiting you. Jack was about 10 minutes behind him, taking the same route. They'd both been at a command dinner, but Tom left early to see you before deployment." Maggie remembered that night with painful clarity, their last night together before what would have been Tom's third deployment. They had argued about something trivial, the kind of domestic disagreement that becomes catastrophic only in hindsight, when there is no chance to apologize or reconcile it. Jack came around that bend and saw the bike down. Tom had hit a patch of oil or something, lost control on the curve. Jack performed CPR until the ambulance arrived, but the impact... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Maggie had seen the closed casket at the funeral, had understood without being told that Tom's injuries had been catastrophic. "Jack never forgave himself," Bones continued. "Felt like he should have left the dinner earlier, should have been riding with Tom instead of behind him. Might have been able to warn him about the oil slick. Pure survivor's guilt, but you can't reason with that kind of thing." Maggie nodded, intimately familiar with the irrational mechanics of grief and guilt. It wasn't his fault. Try telling him that. For 12 years he's carried that weight. Started the Iron Legion partly because of Tom. Wanted to create something that would help veterans find purpose after service, but also to promote motorcycle safety. Each member has to take advanced riding courses, first aid training, the whole 9 yards. A memorial in motion, Maggie thought. Not stone and bronze, but flesh and blood and purpose. "And his son?" she asked, remembering the letter in Jack's pocket. "Ben Wright." Something darkened in Bones's expression. "That's complicated. Ben blamed Jack for not preventing Tom's accident. They had a falling out when Ben was 16, barely spoken since." Before Maggie could process this new piece of the puzzle, the double doors swung open and a doctor emerged. Not the neurologist from earlier, but a tall man with kind eyes and the slight stoop of someone who had spent decades bending to examine patients. "Family of Jack Harrington?" he inquired, glancing around the waiting room. As one, the Iron Legion rose to their feet. Bones stepped forward, assuming the role of spokesman. "We're his brothers." The doctor nodded, accepting this unconventional family structure without comment. "Mr. Harrington has responded well to the TPA treatment. The clot is dissolving and blood flow is being restored to the affected areas of his brain. However, he's not out of the woods yet. The next 24 hours are critical for determining the extent of recovery. What kind of effects should we expect? Bones asked, voicing the question everyone feared to articulate. The doctor's expression remained professionally neutral. It's too early to say with certainty. He's experiencing weakness on his right side and some speech difficulties, which is common with left hemispheric strokes. But the brain has remarkable plasticity, especially when treatment is administered promptly. The unspoken message hung in the air. They had Maggie to thank for that promptness, for recognizing what they had missed. "When can we see him?" Jake asked, his youthful voice breaking the momentary silence. "He's being transferred to the ICU for close monitoring. Once he's settled, you can visit briefly 1 or 2 at a time." The doctor's gaze found Maggie curiosity in his eyes. "Are you family as well?" Before she could respond, Bones placed a hand on her shoulder. "She's the one who recognized the stroke and got him help. She rode in the ambulance with him." The doctor's expression warmed. "Then you should definitely see him when he's stabilized. Familiar faces can be very beneficial during recovery." With a few more instructions about ICU protocols and visiting hours, the doctor departed, leaving the Legion to process this guarded good news. The tension in the room eased, fractionally, relief tempered by the understanding that Jack's journey was just beginning. "You heard the doc," Bones addressed the group. "He's stable but needs rest. No point in all of us camping out here. I'll stay along with Big Mike since he's the medical proxy. The rest of you head to the motel, get some sleep, and we'll rotate shifts." The Legion members nodded, accepting the direction without argument. The chain of command remained intact, even with their president temporarily incapacitated. As they gathered their belongings, several approached Maggie, offering gruff thanks and respectful nods. She accepted their gratitude with quiet dignity, still processing her unexpected role in this unfolding drama. Bones turned to her as the others filed out. "You should go home too, get some rest." Maggie hesitated, torn between the pull of her ordinary life and the gravitational force of these extraordinary circumstances. "I'd like to see him first, if that's all right." Bones studied her face, seeming to search for her motivation. Whatever he found must have satisfied him, because he nodded once. "I'll let you know when they move him to ICU." Left momentarily alone, Maggie pulled out her phone to call the diner. Dave answered on the second ring, concern evident in his voice. "Maggie, everything okay?" "As okay as it can be," she replied. "Jack, the motorcycle club president, had a stroke. He's stable now, but I'd like to stay a bit longer." "Don't worry about your shift tomorrow," Dave said without hesitation. "Jenny can cover. You do what you need to do." The simple kindness brought unexpected tears to Maggie's eyes. "Thanks, Dave. I owe you." "You don't owe me anything. Just take care of yourself." "Okay." After ending the call, Maggie dialed another number from memory. Her daughter Katie answered almost immediately, her voice bright despite the late hour. "Mom, aren't you supposed to be at work?" "Change of plans," Maggie said, finding herself reluctant to explain the full situation over the phone. "I might be home late tonight or possibly stay in town. Don't wait up." "Mom," Katie's tone shifted, the perceptive awareness that had always made her seem older than her years coming to the fore. "What's going on? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, honey. Just helping someone who needs it. I'll explain everything later." There was a pause, then Katie said, "This sounds like nurse mom, not waitress mom." Maggie smiled despite herself. Her daughter had always been able to read her too well. "Something like that. I'll call you tomorrow with details, I promise." After hanging up, Maggie leaned back in the uncomfortable chair, closing her eyes briefly. Katie's observation echoed in her mind. Nurse mom versus waitress mom. The dichotomy she had lived with since abandoning her medical career, a division that had slowly eroded her sense of self over the years. Today, for the first time in 12 years, Nurse Mom had fully reemerged, taking command in a crisis, acting with the confidence and skill that had once defined her professional identity. And it had felt right, natural, as if she had finally stepped back into her own skin after years of wearing an ill-fitting disguise. "Ms. Collins," she opened her eyes to find a young nurse standing before her. "They've moved Mr. Harrington to ICU. He's asking for you." Surprise rippled through her. "He's conscious, awake and somewhat alert," the nurse confirmed. "Speech is still affected, but he's communicating." Maggie followed the nurse through the labyrinthine corridors of the hospital, the familiar environment both comforting and disconcerting after so many years away. The antiseptic smell, the soft beeping of monitors, the hushed voices of medical staff all awakened muscle memory she had thought long dormant. The ICU was bathed in the perpetual twilight of dimmed lights and monitoring screens, creating islands of illumination around each patient bed. Jack occupied the room at the far end, a solitary figure amid a constellation of medical equipment. Bones stood just outside the glass door, his posture alert despite evident exhaustion. "He's asking for you first," Bones said, a statement that carried implications Maggie wasn't ready to examine. "Says it's important." She nodded, steeling herself before entering the room. Hospital rooms created a strange intimacy, reducing people to their most vulnerable essence. Jack Harrington, the imposing Iron Legion president, whose presence had filled the diner doorway just hours ago, now appeared diminished against the white hospital linens. The right side of his face drooped slightly, and his right arm lay motionless on the blanket. But his left side remained strong, and his eyes, when they found hers, were clear and alert. The stroke had affected his body, but not his essential presence. "Maggie," he said, the words slurred but recognizable. His voice was deeper than she remembered from the diner, a resonant bass despite the effects of the stroke. "Hello, Jack," she replied, approaching the bed with the confidence of her nursing background. She automatically checked the monitors, noting his improved vital signs with professional satisfaction. "How are you feeling?" A ghost of a smile touched the mobile side of his face. "Been better." The simple understatement surprised a small laugh from her appreciation for his stoicism in the face of catastrophic health crisis. She pulled a chair closer to his bed, sitting where he could see her without straining. "The doctors say you responded well to the treatment," and she told him. "The next day or so will be important for recovery." Jack nodded slightly, then with visible effort raised his left hand. He tapped his chest where the inner pocket of his cut would have been. "Letter." "It's safe," Maggie assured him, touching her own pocket where she had transferred both their wallets and the letter. "I have it here." Relief flashed across his features, followed by something more complex. With careful movements, as if each word required physical effort to produce, he said, "Need to tell you about Tom." Maggie felt her heart constrict. "Bones mentioned you were there when the accident happened." Jack shook his head, slightly frustration evident as his body's limitations prevented clear communication. "Not accident, suicide." The word fell between them like a stone, dropped into still water, ripples of shock expanding outward. Maggie stared at him, certain she had misheard or misunderstood his stroke-affected speech. "What did you say?" she whispered. Jack struggled to find the words, his determination evident in the intensity of his gaze. "Tom, deliberate, no skid marks, note in his pocket. For you, military, covered up, protect benefits." Each fragmented phrase struck Maggie with physical force. She gripped the arms of the chair, vertigo threatening to upend her reality. Tom had committed suicide, had deliberately crashed his motorcycle. The military had covered it up to ensure she received survivor benefits. "That's not possible," she said, her voice hollow even to her own ears. "Tom wouldn't." Jack's left hand moved again, this time reaching for hers. His grip was surprisingly strong, anchoring her as her world tilted on its axis. "Deployment. Fourth, not third. PTSD, worse than you knew. Protecting you." Maggie felt tears burning behind her eyes, 12 years of grief, suddenly transmuting into something else entirely. All this time, she had believed Tom's death was a random tragedy, cruel but meaningless. The possibility that it had been deliberate, a choice he had made, altered everything. "Why are you telling me this now?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack's eyes held hers, unflinching, despite the difficulty of speech. "Almost died. Without truth. Carried too long. You deserve to know." The monitors beeped steadily in the background, a rhythmic counterpoint to the chaos of Maggie's thoughts. Outside the glass walls of the ICU room, nurses moved efficiently between patients, the ordinary business of the hospital continuing, despite her personal earthquake. "I don't understand," she said finally. "If there was a note for me, why didn't I receive it?" Jack's expression darkened. "Military took it. Evidence. Commander's decision. Protect the family. Protect benefits. You disagreed, Maggie stated, seeing the old anger in his eyes. He nodded once. My son found out, blamed me for hiding truth, for not stopping Tom. The pieces began to align in Maggie's mind, forming a picture of guilt and silence that had poisoned multiple lives for over a decade. Jack carrying the weight of a truth he had been ordered to conceal. His son Ben discovering that concealment and viewing it as a betrayal, and herself living in ignorance of her husband's final choice. What did the note say? She asked, needing to know, despite the pain the answer would surely bring. Jack's expression softened with compassion. That he loved you. Couldn't face more deployment. Demons too strong, not your fault. Tears spilled down Maggie's cheeks unchecked. The knowledge settled into her bones, a weight she would now carry forever. Yet strangely alongside the pain came a kind of clarity. The questions that had haunted the edges of her consciousness, the inconsistencies in the accident report, that she had refused to examine too closely the subtle changes in Tom's behavior before his death, that she had attributed to pre-deployment stress, all suddenly made a terrible sense. I knew something was wrong, she admitted, her voice breaking. The night before when he visited, he seemed at peace somehow. I thought it was resolution about the deployment, but it was decision already made. Jack finished for her, understanding in his eyes. Not your fault. Nothing you could have done. The absolving words spoken with such certainty by a man who had carried this burden for 12 years penetrated the armor of guilt Maggie hadn't even realized she wore. She had spent over a decade wondering if their trivial argument had somehow contributed to the accident, if Tom had been distracted by anger or hurt when he lost control of his motorcycle. The possibility that his death had been intentional changed everything, yet changed nothing about the depth of her loss. A nurse appeared at the door, pointing meaningfully at her watch. Visiting time was ending even for the woman who had helped save the patient's life. Maggie stood wiping away tears with the back of her hand. I should let you rest. Jack's hand reached for hers again, his grip urgent despite his weakness. The letter. For my son. Will you help find him? Tell him truth from me. The request hung between them, weighted with implications. Jack was asking her to become involved, not just in his medical crisis, but in his personal one as well, to help mend a relationship fractured by the same secret that had shaped her own life. Before she could respond, the monitor suddenly erupted in urgent alarms. Jack's face contorted in pain, his left hand clutching at his chest. The nurse rushed in immediately, assessing the situation with professional efficiency. Blood pressure spiking, heart rate irregular, she announced, pressing the emergency call button. Sir, are you experiencing chest pain? Jack managed a nod, his face gray beneath his weathered tan. Possible complication from the TP, the nurse explained to Maggie as additional staff rushed into the room. You need to step outside now. Maggie found herself in the hallway, watching through the glass as the medical team worked on Jack. Bones appeared at her side, his face tight with concern. What happened? He demanded, anxiety sharpening his tone. Possible cardiac complication from the clot-busting medication, Maggie explained, falling back on her medical knowledge to maintain composure. It's a known risk. The team is responding appropriately. They stood together in helpless vigilance as the crisis unfolded behind the glass. The medical team moved with coordinated precision, administering medications, adjusting equipment, their faces set in the focused concentration familiar to anyone who had worked in emergency medicine. Maggie found herself mentally tracking their actions, identifying medications, understanding the protocol as if she were part of the team rather than an observer. After what seemed an eternity but was likely only minutes, the alarms quieted and the urgent activity around Jack's bed settled into controlled monitoring. One of the doctors emerged, his expression cautiously optimistic. We've stabilized him, he informed them. He experienced a cardiac arrhythmia, which can happen with TP. We've adjusted his medication and will monitor him closely, but he appears to be responding well. Relief washed over Maggie, followed immediately by the realization of how deeply invested she had become in Jack's survival in the span of a single day. This man, a stranger 12 hours ago, now represented a connection to Tom she had thought lost forever. Can we see him? Bones asked. The doctor shook his head. He needs absolute rest now. No visitors until morning at the earliest. I suggest you all go home and get some sleep. Bones looked like he might argue, but ultimately nodded in reluctant acceptance. As the doctor returned to the ICU, Bones turned to Maggie, the events of the day etched in the lines of his face. "I can drive you home," he offered, "or to a motel if you'd prefer to stay in town." Maggie hesitated, weighing her options. Home meant her small house on the outskirts of town where Katie would be waiting with questions she wasn't yet prepared to answer. A motel meant an anonymity space to process the seismic revelations of the day. A motel would be good, she decided. I should stay close in case. She didn't finish the sentence, unwilling to voice the possibility that Jack might take a turn for the worse. Bones nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. "The guys are at the roadside inn about 2 miles from here. Decent place, clean. I can drop you there." The offer surprised her slightly. "You're not staying." "Someone needs to be here," he replied simply. "Just in case, The loyalty touched her, reminding her again that the Iron Legion was more than a motorcycle club. It was a brotherhood forged in military service, in civilian struggles, a family of choice rather than blood. "Jack told me about Tom," she said quietly, "about what really happened." Bones stilled, his expression unreadable in the dim corridor lighting. "He told you that it wasn't an accident, that Tom chose to—" She couldn't bring herself to say the word again. Bones exhaled slowly, a sound weighted with years of carried secrets. "Jack's been wanting to tell you for years. Military ordered silence to protect your benefits, but it ate at him. When Ben found out through some of Jack's old papers, it created a rift that never healed. Ben couldn't understand how Jack could keep that from you, from everyone." "Where is Ben now?" Maggie asked, remembering Jack's request to find his son. "Last we heard, working as an engineer in Seattle. Completely cut ties with Jack about 5 years ago when his mother died. Didn't even come to the funeral." The sadness in Bones's voice spoke to the depth of Jack's loss, a family fractured beyond easy repair. Yet here she was being asked to help mend what seemed unmendable. "Jack asked me to help find Ben," she said, "to deliver the letter he carries." Bones studied her face, his gaze assessing. "And will you—" It was the question she had been asking herself since Jack's request. Logic suggested she should walk away, return to the safe, predictable life she had constructed. The Desert Rose Diner would still be there tomorrow, its rhythms unchanged, its demands uncomplicated. She had a daughter to support, a mother to care for, responsibilities that had nothing to do with Jack Harrington or his estranged son. Yet something had awakened in her today, something she had believed long dead. The nurse who had once saved lives, the woman who had once faced challenges with courage rather than avoidance. The person she had been before grief had narrowed her world to the confines of a small-town diner. "Yes," she said finally, the decision crystallizing even as she spoke it. "I'll help find Ben." Relief softened Bones's weathered features. "Thank you. It would mean everything to Jack." They walked together through the hospital corridors, an unlikely pair united by concern for a mutual connection. Outside, the Arizona night had descended, stars sharp and brilliant against the velvet darkness. The temperature had dropped, the desert's extreme diurnal variation transforming the scorching day into a cool evening. Bones led her to a motorcycle parked in the hospital lot, its polished chrome gleaming under the security lights. Maggie stopped short, the sight triggering memories of Tom's motorcycle, of the closed casket, of 12 years of avoidance. Bones noticed her hesitation. "Problem? I haven't been on a motorcycle since Tom died," she admitted, her voice steady despite the admission. "Haven't even touched one." Understanding dawned in Bones's eyes. "We can call a taxi." Maggie looked at the motorcycle, then at the hospital where Jack lay fighting for recovery. 12 years of avoidance had not protected her from pain. It had merely limited her life. Perhaps it was time to face this particular fear as she had faced so many others today. "No," she said with quiet determination. "I'll ride." Bones nodded, respect evident in his expression. He handed her a helmet, waiting patiently as she adjusted the strap with hands that trembled only slightly. Then he mounted the bike, holding it steady as she climbed on behind him. "Hold on to my waist," he instructed. "Lean when I lean, but let me control the bike." Maggie wrapped her arms around his solid torso, the leather of his cut cool against her hands. The engine roared to life beneath them, a sound that had once been as familiar to her as Tom's laughter. The vibration traveled up through her body, awakening sensory memories long suppressed. As they pulled out of the hospital parking lot, Maggie felt a complex emotion rise within her, a mixture of fear and exhilaration and grief and something that might, with time, become healing. The wind against her face carried the scent of desert sage and motorcycle exhaust, a combination that transported her back to happier times with Tom, to rides through this same landscape, with her arms wrapped around his waist, her heart full of love and security. The road stretched before them, illuminated by the motorcycle's headlight. Maggie found herself relaxing incrementally, muscle memory returning as they leaned into the gentle curves of the highway. Bones rode with confident skill, neither too fast nor too cautiously, respecting both the machine and his passenger. The roadside inn appeared ahead, a modest motel with a neon vacancy sign casting blue and red reflections on the parking lot. Several motorcycles were already parked outside. The Iron Legion members gathered in small groups, smoking and talking quietly. Bones pulled into an empty space, cutting the engine. The sudden silence felt profound, as if the world had momentarily paused to acknowledge a threshold crossed. Maggie dismounted with surprising steadiness, removing the helmet and running a hand through her hair. "You okay?" Bones asked, studying her face in the neon-tinted darkness. "Better than I expected," she replied honestly. "Thank you for the ride." The Iron Legion members approached, curiosity and respect mingling in their expressions. Jake, the young rider who had offered her his jacket earlier, stepped forward. "We got you a room," he said, offering her a keycard. "2 doors down from us. Hope that's okay." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her. "That's very kind. Thank you." "Least we could do," said another rider, older, with a gray beard and gentle eyes. "You saved our president today." Maggie shook her head slightly. "I just recognized the symptoms. The medical team did the saving." "Still," Jake insisted, "not many people would have stepped up like that, especially with a bunch like us." The simple acknowledgement of what she had done, of the courage it had taken to confront 15 leather-clad motorcycle club members about their president's vulnerability, settled something within Maggie. These men, so different from her in lifestyle and experience, saw her more clearly than she had seen herself in years. "I'll head back to the hospital," Bones said, his voice cutting through the moment. "Call if anything changes." The others nodded, the rotation of vigilance, understood without explanation. Maggie realized this was how they had operated in combat zones, keeping watch over their own with unwavering dedication. As Bones rode away, engine fading into the distance, Jake offered to show Maggie to her room. She followed him along the motel walkway, fatigue suddenly washing over her in a wave. The day's events, the medical emergency, the ambulance ride, the revelations about Tom, the emotional and physical demands, had depleted her reserves completely. "Here you are," Jake said, stopping at room 115. "We're in 113 and 114 if you need anything. Anything at all." "Thank you, Jake," Maggie said sincerely. "For everything." Inside the modest motel room, Maggie sat on the edge of the bed, the events of the day washing over her in waves of emotion. She pulled out her phone, staring at the screen for a long moment before dialing Katie's number. Her daughter answered immediately, concern evident in her voice. "Mom, where are you? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Maggie assured her, though fine hardly encompassed the complexity of her current state. "I'm staying at a motel in town tonight. There's a situation I need to help with." "What kind of situation?" Katie asked, the perceptive edge in her voice reminding Maggie so much of Tom that it created a physical ache in her chest. "It's complicated," Maggie began, and then realized her daughter deserved more than evasion. "I helped someone today, a man having a stroke at the diner. I rode with him to the hospital, and it turns out he knew your father." Silence stretched across the connection, Katie absorbing this unexpected connection to the father she had lost when she was only 7. "Knew Dad, how?" "They served together," Maggie said, carefully navigating the complex truth. "He was with Dad when the accident happened." Another silence, this one weighted with unasked questions. Katie had grown up with the sanitized version of Tom's death, protected from details a child shouldn't have to bear. At 19, studying pre-med and planning to become a doctor, was she ready for the truth? "Is he okay?" "The man who had the stroke," Katie asked, finally prioritizing the immediate concern. "Stable for now," Maggie replied. "His name is Jack Harrington. He's the president of a motorcycle club called the Iron Legion, mostly veterans. And you're staying to help him?" Katie's voice held no judgment, only curiosity. "Yes, he has an estranged son he wants to reconnect with. I told him I'd help. The simplicity of the explanation belied the complexity of the situation, but it was truth enough for now. The full story would come later when they were face to face, when Maggie herself had processed the revelations that had altered her understanding of the past 12 years. You sound different, Mom, Katie observed. More like before. Before, the word hung between them laden with meaning. Before Tom's death, before Maggie abandoned nursing, before their lives contracted to the safe confines of small-town routine. I feel different, Maggie admitted. Today I was a nurse again, not just a waitress. It felt right. Maybe this is a sign, Katie suggested, the optimism of youth coloring her words. Maybe it's time for you to go back to what you love. The simplicity of her daughter's perspective brought a smile to Maggie's lips. Maybe I'm taking it one day at a time for now. They talked a few minutes longer before saying goodnight, Maggie promising to call with updates tomorrow. After hanging up, she sat in the stillness of the motel room, turning her wallet over in her hands. Finally, she opened it, removing Tom's medal and Jack's letter to his son. The Navy SEAL trident gleamed in the lamplight, the eagle and anchor and trident, symbolizing the elite force her husband had been so proud to join. She had carried it as a talisman of sorts, a physical connection to the man she had lost. Now she wondered if it had also been a way of holding on to unanswered questions, of keeping the wound slightly open, because complete healing would mean truly accepting his absence. Beside it, Jack's letter to Ben represented another kind of pain, another relationship severed by circumstance and misunderstanding. The parallel wasn't lost on Maggie, the symmetry of her position as both a grieving widow and a potential bridge between father and son. She didn't open the letter. Whatever Jack had written to his estranged son was private, meant for Ben's eyes alone. But she held it gently, recognizing it for what it was, an attempt to cross a gulf that seemed uncrossable, to speak truths that had remained too long unspoken. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, finding Ben, convincing him to read his father's words, facing her own evolving understanding of Tom's death. But for now, in this quiet motel room on the edge of the Arizona desert, Maggie Collins allowed herself to simply be present with the day's revelations, neither running from them nor being consumed by them. Outside, the desert night deepened, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. Inside the roadside inn, an unlikely collection of individuals were bound together by circumstance and choice, their separate stories now intertwined in ways none could have predicted when dawn broke over the Desert Rose Diner just 14 hours earlier. In room 115, Maggie finally lay down, not bothering to undress, too exhausted for such niceties. Sleep claimed her almost instantly, her body demanding rest after the day's extraordinary demands. Her last conscious thought was not of the past, but of the immediate future morning, and a return to the hospital where Jack Harrington fought for recovery, where the next chapter of this unexpected story would begin to unfold. Dawn broke over the Arizona desert with painterly precision. First a faint glow along the eastern horizon, then a wash of pale gold, and finally the full brilliance of morning sun transforming the landscape. Maggie Collins woke to this desert symphony of light playing across the motel room's faded curtains, momentarily disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings. Reality returned in stages. The events of yesterday reassembled themselves in her mind. The Iron Legion at the Desert Rose Diner, Jack's stroke, the ambulance ride, the revelation about Tom, the letter to an estranged son. Each memory clicked into place like puzzle pieces, forming a picture she was still learning to recognize. She checked her phone, 6:17 a.m. One missed call from Bones at 2:43 a.m., followed by a text message. Jack stable, awake briefly, asked for you. Visiting hours start 8 a.m. The simple message carried complex implications. Jack's continued concern for her involvement suggested this connection wouldn't end with a single day's drama. The bathroom mirror revealed the toll of yesterday's events. Her honey blonde hair hung limp around her face, dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her diner uniform was rumpled beyond salvation. She splashed cold water on her face, bringing momentary clarity, if not actual refreshment. A knock at the door startled her. Opening it revealed Jake, the young Legion member, holding a plastic shopping bag and a cardboard tray with 2 coffee cups. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his youthful face earnest beneath his carefully maintained beard. "Thought you might need these." He offered the bag and one of the coffees. Inside the bag, Maggie found basic toiletries, a Desert Valley Medical Center t-shirt, and a pair of simple black leggings. The guys and I figured you didn't have time to pack anything, Jake explained, a slight flush coloring his neck. The gift shop at the hospital opens early. Hope the sizes are okay. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Maggie deeply. These men, stereotyped by society as dangerous outsiders, had shown more consideration than many would expect. Thank you, Jake, she said sincerely. This is incredibly kind. He shrugged, embarrassed by the gratitude. Least we could do. Bones called about an hour ago. Jack had a stable night. Doctor says we can visit at 8. I'll be ready. Maggie promised, accepting the coffee with appreciation. 30 minutes later, showered and changed into the hospital gift shop clothes, Maggie felt marginally more human. The t-shirt was a size too large, the leggings a touch too short, but they were clean and comfortable. Vast improvements over her wrinkled uniform. Outside her room, 3 Iron Legion motorcycles waited, engines already purring in the morning air. Jake stood beside one holding an extra helmet. Behind him, 2 older members nodded respectful greetings. We're your escort to the hospital, Jake explained, offering the helmet. If you're comfortable riding, that is. Yesterday's ride with Bones had breached a 12-year barrier. Today's offer represented a choice: retreat back to safety or continue forward into uncomfortable growth. Maggie took the helmet without hesitation. Who am I riding with? She asked. Jake grinned, pleasure evident in his expression. Me, if that's all right. I promise I'm a careful driver. The ride to Desert Valley Medical Center traversed the same desert landscape Maggie had seen from the ambulance windows yesterday, but the morning perspective transformed everything. Colors were sharper, shadows more defined, the beauty of the desert more apparent without the life or death urgency of yesterday's journey. Jake rode with careful precision, clearly conscious of his passengers' comfort. Maggie found herself relaxing incrementally, the sensation of the motorcycle beneath her awakening muscle memory rather than trauma. The wind carried the scent of sage and creosote bush, distinctly southwestern fragrances that had become home during her years in Arizona. By the time they reached the hospital parking lot, Maggie felt a subtle shift in her relationship with motorcycles. Not comfortable yet, certainly not at ease, but no longer defined by pure avoidance. It was a small victory, but significant in its implications. Bones waited for them at the hospital entrance, his weathered face showing evidence of a sleepless night. His expression brightened marginally when he saw Maggie, relief evident in the slight relaxation of his posture. He's awake, Bones said by way of greeting. Speech is still affected, but he's communicating. Right side weakness continues, but he's alert and oriented. Any more cardiac events? Maggie asked, falling naturally into medical terminology. One minor arrhythmia around midnight, controlled with medication. Bones ran a hand over his salt and pepper mustache, a gesture Maggie was beginning to recognize as his tell for concern. Doctor says that's normal with the TPA treatment, but they're monitoring him closely. They made their way through the hospital corridors, the Legion members moving with the slightly stiff bearing of men uncomfortable in medical settings, but determined to support their fallen brother. At the ICU entrance, a nurse informed them that only 2 visitors were permitted at a time. Bones looked to Maggie, a silent question in his eyes. You go first, she said, understanding his need to see his friend and president. I'll wait. Bones nodded gratefully and entered the ICU, with Jake leaving Maggie in the waiting area with the other Legion members. She used the time to call Katie, reassuring her daughter that everything was under control and promising a full explanation soon. Then she called Dave at the Desert Rose Diner, thanking him again for covering her shift and providing a brief update on Jack's condition. 20 minutes later, Bones emerged with Jake, his expression more settled than before. He's asking for you, Bones told Maggie. Seems pretty insistent. Something in his tone caught Maggie's attention. Is everything okay? Bones hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Jack's made a decision. Wants to talk to you about it before anyone else. The cryptic statement left Maggie puzzled but determined. She entered the ICU, the familiar medical environment triggering her professional demeanor, despite her civilian clothes. Jack's room was the same as yesterday, but the atmosphere had changed from crisis to recovery. The monitoring equipment remained, but with less urgency in its readouts. Jack himself looked marginally better color, returning to his face despite the persistent droop on the right side. His eyes brightened when he saw her recognition, and something like relief evident in his gaze. Maggie, he said, the words still slurred but more distinct than yesterday. You came back. She approached his bedside, automatically checking the monitors with a nurse's practiced glance. Of course I came back. How are you feeling this morning? Like I've been hit by a truck, he replied, his attempt at humor marred by the effort speaking clearly required. But alive, thanks to you. Maggie shook her head slightly. Thanks to prompt medical treatment, I just recognized the symptoms. Jack's left hand moved in dismissal of her modesty. You saved my life. Don't diminish that. There was something in his tone, a command presence that transcended his current physical limitations that prevented further argument. Maggie simply nodded, acknowledging his perspective without necessarily agreeing with it. Bones said you wanted to talk to me, she prompted gently. Jack's expression shifted, determination replacing casual conversation. With visible effort, he formed each word, carefully fighting against the neurological deficits the stroke had imposed. I want you to find Ben. Give him my letter. Tell him everything. The request hung in the air between them, weighted with implications. Yesterday, in the emotional chaos following his revelation about Tom's death, Maggie had agreed without fully considering what such a task would entail. In the clarity of morning, the complexity became apparent. Jack, she began carefully, I'm willing to help, but finding your son and convincing him to listen will be challenging. Bones mentioned he completely cut ties with you. Jack nodded, frustration flashing across his features at his impaired communication. I know. Stubborn, like me. A ghost of a smile touched the mobile side of his face. But this, he gestured weakly at his hospital bed, at his stroke-affected body, changes perspective. Life, too short for silence. The simple wisdom resonated deeply with Maggie, echoing her own evolving understanding after yesterday's revelations. 12 years of carrying unasked questions, of living with incomplete truth, had shaped her existence in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. Do you know where Ben is now? She asked, practical considerations surfacing. Seattle, works for engineering firm. Bones has details. Maggie nodded, mentally calculating logistics. Seattle was at least a 2-day drive from their current location in Arizona, longer if one avoided highways and took the scenic coastal route. Flying would be faster but more expensive. Either way, it meant temporarily abandoning her life in Arizona, her job at the diner, her routines. Why me? She asked finally, the question that had been building since yesterday. You have brothers in the Legion who would do this for you. Why ask me, a stranger, until yesterday? Jack held her gaze, his eyes clear and focused despite his physical limitations. Not a stranger, Tom's wife. The connection matters. Ben might listen to you, understand through you. The truth about Tom affects you both. The logic was sound, if uncomfortable. Maggie and Ben were connected by the same concealed truth, both affected by decisions made 12 years ago in the aftermath of Tom's death. Perhaps that shared impact created a foundation for conversation that wouldn't exist between Ben and another Legion member. When would you want me to— Oh, she asked, the question itself an acknowledgement of acceptance. Soon, Jack replied. Doctor says recovery, months of therapy, might not ride again. The admission clearly cost him the prospect of never returning to his motorcycle, a profound loss. Need to make peace with Ben, while I can. The mortality awareness that often accompanied major health crises was evident in Jack's words. The stroke had forced him to confront not only his physical limitations, but his emotional unfinished business as well. I'll need a few days to arrange things, Maggie said, mentally cataloging what would need to be addressed. My daughter, my job, my mother's care. Jack nodded, understanding. Take time needed. But please, soon. I promise, Maggie said, the words carrying more weight than a casual reassurance. She was committing to something significant, something that would potentially alter multiple lives, including her own. A nurse appeared at the doorway, signaling that visiting time was ending. Maggie rose from her chair, touching Jack's hand briefly in farewell. I'll come back this afternoon, she promised. Get some rest. In the hospital corridor, Bones waited alone, the other Legion members presumably in the cafeteria or outside smoking. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes held questions. He asked you to find Ben, he stated rather than asked. Maggie nodded. He said you have the details, where Ben works, how to contact him. Bones sighed heavily, running a hand through his short gray hair. I do, been keeping tabs on the kid for years, just in case Jack ever wanted to reach out. or in case something happened and we needed to notify him. Something like a stroke, Maggie observed. Something like that. Bones gestured toward the elevator. Let's get coffee. We need to talk. The hospital cafeteria offered institutional coffee in institutional surroundings, but it provided privacy for conversation. They claimed a corner table steam rising from their mediocre beverages, the morning sunlight creating geometric patterns through the large windows. Ben works for Cascade Engineering in Seattle. Bones began without preamble. Been there about 3 years. Good position from what I can gather. Lives alone in an apartment downtown. No wife, no kids, no serious relationship that we know of. The level of detail suggested more than casual observation. You've had him under surveillance, Maggie asked, surprise evident in her tone. Bones shook his head. Nothing that intrusive. We have members in various places, including Seattle. They keep an eye out, report if they happen to see him. Plus, the internet makes finding information pretty easy these days. He sipped his coffee, grimacing at the taste before continuing. Ben's a good kid, smart, graduated top of his class from Cal Poly, but he's got his father's stubbornness and his mother's temper. Once he makes up his mind about something changing, it is like moving a mountain with your bare hands. And he's made up his mind about Jack, Maggie concluded. About Jack, about the Legion, about the military code of silence that kept the truth about Tom's death hidden. Bones set his coffee cup down with careful precision. When Ben found those documents, he was 16, already having typical teenage issues with authority, with his father being gone on Legion business with his mother's illness. The revelation that Jack had kept the truth about Tom's suicide hidden was the final straw. Maggie absorbed this information, trying to understand the dynamic she would be walking into. Do you think he'll even agree to meet with me? Honestly, I don't know. If you approach him as Jack's messenger, probably not. But if you approach him as Tom's widow seeking your own answers, Bones left the implication hanging. The suggestion made Maggie uncomfortable, though she recognized its strategic value. I won't lie to him. Not suggesting you should, Bones clarified quickly, just highlighting the reality that your connection to Tom gives you an opening Ben might respect. It was true, if somewhat manipulative. Her status as Tom's widow created a legitimacy that no Legion member could claim. And she did have her own questions, her own need for closure that Ben might understand. When Jack first had the stroke, Bones continued, I called Ben, left a message about his father's condition. No response. The information wasn't surprising, but added another layer of complexity to an already difficult mission. If Ben wouldn't even respond to news of his father's life-threatening medical condition, how would he respond to a stranger bringing a letter? Do you think a letter will make any difference? Maggie asked, voicing the doubt that had been forming since Jack's request. Bones considered the question seriously, his weathered face thoughtful. Jack's never been much for writing, more a man of action than words. The fact that he wrote to Ben at all is significant, and after the stroke, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Facing mortality changes a man, makes him see what matters. For Jack, that's making peace with his son. The sentiment resonated with Maggie's own experience of loss and regret. The things left unsaid between her and Tom before his death that still haunted her at times, the trivial argument that had been their final interaction, a wound that had never properly healed. 2 days later, Maggie stood in the hospital parking lot beside a silver sedan. The rental car gleamed in the Arizona sun, packed with everything she would need for the journey to Seattle. The Iron Legion had arranged everything from the vehicle to a detailed route with recommended stops along the way. She had just finished her final visit with Jack before departure. His condition had improved slightly, speech clearer, though still affected, and the physical therapists were cautiously optimistic about his prospects for recovery. The moment of farewell had been unexpectedly emotional. Jack's grip on her hand, strong despite his weakened state. Thank you, he had said, the simple words carrying the weight of everything he couldn't yet articulate smoothly. Now Bones stood beside her at the car, his expression a mixture of concern and gratitude. You sure you don't want one of us to ride with you? Seattle's a long way. Maggie shook her head. This is something I need to do alone, for Jack, for Ben, and for myself. Bones nodded, respecting her decision. You've got our numbers. Any trouble day or night you call. Legion has chapters all along your route. Someone can be with you within an hour, no matter where you are. The safety net was reassuring, though Maggie hoped she wouldn't need it. She had always prided herself on self-reliance, but the events of the past few days had reminded her that independence didn't have to mean isolation. "I'll call with updates," she promised. "And once I find Ben—" "Good luck," Bones said, stepping back as she opened the car door. "And Maggie, whatever happens with Ben, you've already done more for Jack than you know." The highway stretched before her, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desert landscape. Maggie settled into the rhythm of the road, the miles passing beneath her wheels as she headed northwest. Her mind alternated between planning her approach to Ben and processing her evolving understanding of Tom's death. The rental car's stereo played softly classic rock that Tom had loved, that had formed the soundtrack to their early years together. She found comfort in the familiar melodies, a connection to the past that felt less painful than it might have just days ago. By nightfall, she had reached Flagstaff, the elevation bringing a welcome coolness after the desert heat. She checked into a modest motel called Katie to report her progress and spent the evening reviewing the information Bones had provided about Ben Harrington. 31 years old, graduated with honors in mechanical engineering. Currently employed as a project manager at Cascade Engineering, specializing in sustainable infrastructure systems. Lived in a downtown apartment building, walking distance to his office. No social media presence that they could find, which Bones attributed to Ben's desire for privacy and distance from his father's world. The next day brought her through Utah and Idaho, the landscape transforming from desert to mountains to rolling farmland. She stopped only for fuel and quick meals, determined to reach Seattle by the following afternoon. The driving gave her time to think, to rehearse different approaches to this man who had every reason to reject her message. As she crossed into Washington State on the third day, rain began to fall, a gentle welcome to the Pacific Northwest. Seattle appeared on the horizon, its skyline partially obscured by low clouds, the Space Needle a distinctive silhouette against the gray sky. She had booked a small hotel room downtown, not far from Ben's apartment building and office. After checking in and refreshing herself, she stood at the window looking out at the rain-slicked streets below. Seattle was as different from the Arizona desert as possible. Green and wet, where home was brown, and dry cool, where home was hot, bustling urban energy, where home was small-town quiet. Tomorrow she would attempt to find Ben at his office. Tonight she needed to prepare herself for what might be a difficult encounter. She placed Jack's letter on the nightstand alongside Tom's Navy SEAL trident. These two objects, weighted with meaning beyond their physical presence, represented the intersecting threads of past and present that had brought her to this rainy city 3 states away from home. Morning brought lighter rain and broken clouds. Maggie dressed with care in clothes she had packed for this specific purpose, professional, without being formal, approachable, without being casual. She tucked Jack's letter into her purse, left the hotel, and walked the 6 blocks to the Cascade Engineering Building, a modern glass and steel structure in the heart of downtown. The lobby featured soaring ceilings, living green walls, and a sleek reception desk staffed by a young woman with a professional smile. "Good morning, may I help you?" Maggie had rehearsed this moment repeatedly during her long drive. "I'm here to see Ben Harrington. I don't have an appointment, but it's a personal matter of some urgency." The receptionist's smile remained in place, though her eyes showed a hint of wariness. "May I tell him who's calling?" "Maggie Collins. I was married to a colleague of his father's." The careful phrasing was neither deceptive nor fully revealing, a delicate balance Maggie had considered carefully. The receptionist nodded, picked up her phone, and pressed a few buttons. "Mr. Harrington, there's a Maggie Collins here to see you. She says she was married to a colleague of your father's." A pause. "Yes, I'll tell her." She hung up and looked at Maggie with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Harrington is in meetings all day. He suggested you could email him to schedule a time." Maggie had anticipated this possibility. "Please tell him that I've come from Arizona and that I have information about Lieutenant Thomas Collins that might interest him." "I'll wait." The receptionist hesitated, then made the call again, relaying the message. This time the response was different. After hanging up, she said, "Mr. Harrington will see you for 5 minutes. Take the elevator to the 10th floor, turn right, and speak to the project coordinator at the desk." "Thank you," Maggie said, relief washing through her. The first hurdle cleared. The 10th floor featured an open office layout with glass-walled conference rooms along the perimeter. A young man with dark hair and intense blue eyes approached as she stepped off the elevator. He bore an unmistakable resemblance to Jack, though leaner in build, and with a guardedness that his father lacked. "Ms. Collins," his voice was cool, professional. "I'm Ben Harrington." "You mentioned Lieutenant Collins." Maggie nodded, studying the face of Jack's estranged son. "Is there somewhere we could speak privately?" Ben's expression remained neutral, but Maggie detected a subtle tension in his stance. "My office. 5 minutes." He led her to a small, glass-walled office at the corner of the floor, closing the door behind them. The space was meticulously organized, free of personal items, except for a single photograph of a smiling woman Maggie recognized as Linda, Jack's late wife, and Ben's mother. Ben didn't invite her to sit. "How do you know my father?" The directness was reminiscent of Jack, though lacking the older man's warmth. Maggie answered honestly. "We met 3 days ago. He came into the diner where I work in Arizona. He was having a stroke. I recognized the symptoms and got him to the hospital." Something flickered in Ben's eyes at the mention of his father's medical crisis, though his expression remained controlled. "I received a message about that. He's stable, I gather. He's recovering. The prognosis is cautiously optimistic." Maggie paused, weighing her next words carefully. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because your father asked me to deliver something to you, and because I learned something about my husband's death that connects to your father and to you." Ben's composure wavered slightly. "Your husband, Lieutenant Thomas Collins, Navy SEAL Echo Team. He died 12 years ago in a motorcycle accident." Maggie watched Ben's face carefully as she spoke. "Or at least that's what I was told. Your father was with him when he died." Recognition dawned in Ben's expression, followed by a complexity of emotions too rapid to identify individually. "You're Tom Collins' widow." "Yes." Maggie reached into her purse, withdrew Jack's letter. "Your father wrote this for you. He asked me to deliver it personally." Ben stared at the envelope, making no move to take it. "Why would he send you? Why not one of his Legion brothers?" "Because we share something. We both learned the truth about Tom's death after years of believing the official story, and we both have to live with what that means." Maggie set the letter on his desk. "I don't know what's in this letter. That's between you and your father. But I know what it feels like to have the past rewritten in an instant, to have certainties suddenly questioned." Ben's gaze moved from the letter to Maggie's face, suspicion warring with curiosity. "My father had 12 years to tell you the truth. He chose silence. He was under orders. The military wanted to protect my benefits, my daughter's future." The explanation sounded hollow even to her own ears, though she understood the reasoning. "I'm not defending his choice, but I understand the weight he carried, the same weight you've carried since you found out." Ben looked away, his profile sharp against the rainy window behind him. For a moment, he looked so much like Jack that Maggie's breath caught. "5 minutes are up, Ms. Collins." Maggie nodded, accepting the dismissal without argument. She placed a business card beside the letter. "My cell number and hotel information. I'll be in Seattle for 3 more days. If you read the letter and want to talk, call me." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Your father might not ride again. The stroke affected his right side significantly. He said that changes perspective, made him see what matters." She met Ben's gaze steadily. Whatever is in that letter, it mattered enough for him to ask a stranger to drive 1,000 miles to deliver it. That's worth something, even if only 5 minutes of your time. Without waiting for a response, she left, feeling Ben's eyes on her back as she walked through the office toward the elevator. She had done what she came to do. Now the choice was his. The hotel room felt confining after the emotional intensity of the encounter with Ben. Maggie changed into more comfortable clothes and ventured out into the rainy city, walking without direction, letting the gentle precipitation wash away some of the tension. Seattle was beautiful in the rain, the city seeming to come alive under the steady drizzle. She found herself at the waterfront, watching ferries cross the Sound, the distant mountains appearing and disappearing behind veils of mist. The setting could not have been more different from the stark clarity of the Arizona desert, yet there was something soothing in the soft edges and muted colors of this northwestern landscape. Her phone remained silent through the afternoon and evening. She hadn't really expected Ben to call immediately, if at all. The young man she had met was deeply guarded, the wounds of his estrangement from Jack evident beneath his professional exterior. The letter might not be enough to breach those defenses. She ate dinner at a small seafood restaurant near her hotel, then, returned to her room exhausted from the emotional and physical journey of the past few days. Sleep claimed her quickly, dreamless and deep. The ringing of her phone woke her just after 7 the next morning. The display showed an unfamiliar Seattle number. She answered, her voice still rough with sleep. Maggie Collins. Ms. Collins. Ben Harrington. His voice sounded different, less controlled, with an undercurrent of something she couldn't quite identify. Can you meet me for coffee this morning? Hope fluttered cautiously. Yes. Where and when? There's a cafe called Rainier's 2 blocks west of your hotel. 8:30 p.m. I'll be there, she promised, already calculating how quickly she could shower and dress. Rainier's Cafe was a cozy establishment with exposed brick walls and the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee. Ben was already seated at a corner table when she arrived, 2 mugs steaming before him. He stood as she approached, a gesture of ingrained courtesy that reminded her again of Jack. I ordered for both of us, he said, gesturing to the second chair. The barista recommended their house blend. Thank you, Maggie replied, taking the offered seat. She studied Ben's face, noting the shadows beneath his eyes that hadn't been present yesterday. You read the letter. It wasn't a question, but he nodded confirmation. Twice. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture so like his father's that it created an ache of recognition in Maggie's chest. He told you about Tom, about what really happened. Yes, in the hospital after his stroke. He said he couldn't die without telling me the truth. Maggie wrapped her hands around the warm mug, drawing comfort from its heat. It changed everything I thought I knew about my husband's death. Ben's gaze was penetrating, assessing her reaction. And how do you feel about that? The question was unexpected in its directness, yet exactly what she herself had been grappling with since Jack's revelation. Confused, angry sometimes, sad always, but also relieved in a way. There were things about Tom's behavior before his death that never made sense. Now they do. Relieved, Ben repeated the word, carrying a weight of implication. That's not what I felt when I found out. I felt betrayed by my father, by the military, by the whole system that decided a lie was better than the truth. Maggie nodded, understanding his perspective. You were 16, old enough to understand, young enough to feel the injustice keenly. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been. My father asked me to keep the secret. Ben continued, his voice tight with controlled emotion. To protect you and your daughter. To honor Tom's choice. But all I could see was the hypocrisy. The Iron Legion, built on brotherhood and honesty, founded on a fundamental lie. Not a lie, Maggie countered gently. A selective truth. The accident happened. Tom died. Your father was there. All true. The intention behind it was what was concealed. Ben's eyes flashed. That's splitting hairs. The point is, my father chose loyalty to a code over honesty with Tom's family. How could I trust anything he said after that? The pain was evident now, breaking through his careful composure. This wasn't just about Tom or Jack or military honor. This was about a son who had lost faith in his father at a formative age, who had built his adult identity partly in opposition to that betrayal. What did Jack say in his letter? Maggie asked quietly. Ben looked away, his gaze finding the rainy street outside the cafe window. That he was wrong. That he should have told you the truth years ago, regulations be damned. That he was sorry for putting that burden on me when I found out. His voice roughened. That he's proud of the man I've become, even though he barely knows me anymore. The simple summary carried echoes of Jack's direct communication style, the military precision of a man who valued clarity. Yet between those lines lay years of regret, of missed opportunities, of a father watching his son from a distance. He's dying. Ben's voice was barely audible. Isn't he? The question startled Maggie. No, not dying, recovering actually. The stroke was serious, but he responded well to treatment. With physical therapy, he could regain significant function. Relief crossed Ben's features, quickly masked. In his letter, he wrote as if he might not have much time left, as if this was his last chance. Understanding dawned. A stroke changes your perspective on mortality. Suddenly, you're aware of how fragile everything is, how quickly it can all end. She paused, considering her next words carefully. He might not ride again, Ben. For a man like your father, that's a kind of death in itself. Ben nodded, the significance not lost on him. The Iron Legion was his life after Mom died, after I left. It still is, Maggie replied, but something can be your life without being your whole life. There's room for more, for healing old wounds, for new beginnings. They sat in silence for a moment, the ambient sounds of the cafe washing over them. Finally, Ben spoke again, his voice steadier. He asked me to come see him, in the letter. Will you? Maggie asked simply. Ben's gaze returned to her face, studying her with the same intensity Jack had shown in the hospital. Would you go back, Ms. Collins, if Tom had survived, if he'd chosen to leave, and you'd discovered the truth years later? Would you go back? The hypothetical scenario struck at the heart of her own unresolved feelings. Would she, could she forgive such a profound choice made without her input, a decision that had shaped her life and Katie's in ways they'd never chosen? Yes, she said finally, the answer surprising her even as she spoke it. Not to pick up where we left off, not to pretend nothing had changed, but to understand, to find some kind of peace with it, to let Katie know her father, even the broken parts of him. Something shifted in Ben's expression, a softening around the edges. I'll think about it. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. For now, it was enough. 1 year later, the Arizona desert bloomed with spring wildflowers, patches of vibrant color against the rugged landscape. Outside the Desert Rose Diner, a line of motorcycles gleamed in the morning sun. The Iron Legion assembled for their annual memorial ride. Maggie stepped out of the diner, wiping her hands on her apron. She was still a waitress 3 days a week, but the other 4 she spent at Desert Valley Medical Center, where she had returned to nursing part-time in the stroke recovery unit. The dual roles suited her, balancing the quiet routine of the diner with the meaningful challenges of patient care. A familiar rumble approached from the highway. Maggie smiled as a lone motorcycle appeared, its rider handling it with the careful precision of someone who had relearned a vital skill. Jack Harrington pulled into the parking lot, his bike modified with controls that accommodated his partially recovered right side. The physical therapy had been grueling, the progress measured in small increments over months of determined effort. Jack would never regain full function on his right side, would always move with a slight limp, would always speak with a subtle slurring when tired. But he rode again, led the Legion again, lived fully in the life he had nearly lost. Behind Jack's motorcycle came another, the rider younger, but with the same commanding presence. Ben had come to Arizona 3 weeks after Maggie's visit to Seattle. The reunion with his father had been difficult at first, years of estrangement, creating a chasm not easily bridged. But they had found common ground in the letter, in the shared understanding of Tom's choice and the recognition that life was too short for silence. Now Ben lived in Phoenix, close enough to visit regularly but maintaining his independence. His engineering expertise had found a home with a firm specializing in sustainable desert architecture. More importantly, he had begun the slow process of reconnecting with the Iron Legion, understanding for the first time the brotherhood that had sustained his father through difficult years. Jack dismounted his motorcycle with practiced movements, removing his helmet to reveal silver hair, now cut shorter for practicality. His face lit with a smile when he saw Maggie. Ready for your first official ride with the Legion? He asked, his voice carrying the same authority it had when they first met, despite the slight slurring. Maggie nodded, surprised to find herself genuinely excited rather than anxious. Over the past year, she had gradually reacquainted herself with motorcycles, first as a passenger, then taking lessons from Jake until she felt confident enough to ride her own. The bike waiting for her was a Harley Softail, specifically chosen for its manageable weight and smooth handling. The Legion had presented it to her 3 months ago, a gesture of inclusion that had moved her to tears. The custom paint job featured a subtle integration of Tom's Navy SEAL trident within the Legion insignia, a memorial, and an affirmation in one image. Ben approached, clapping a hand on his father's shoulder in easy camaraderie. Katie says she'll meet us at the memorial site. She's bringing Grandma, too. Maggie smiled, thinking of her daughter and mother waiting at the desert location where the Legion held their annual remembrance ceremony. Katie was in her 2nd year of medical school. Now her determination to become a trauma surgeon strengthened by the events of the past year. She wore her father's dog tags around her neck, no longer a symbol of loss, but a connection to a man she was finally coming to understand through his brothers and his choices, both good and flawed. We should get moving, Jack said, checking his watch. We're burning daylight. The Legion mounted their bikes' engines, roaring to life in synchronized harmony. Maggie pulled on her helmet, feeling the familiar flutter of anticipation as she swung her leg over her motorcycle. Jack and Ben flanked her as she started her engine a protective formation that would guide her through this first official ride. As they pulled onto the highway desert stretching endlessly before them, Maggie felt a profound sense of rightness. The wind against her face carried the scent of sage and creosote bush, of sun-warmed asphalt, of motorcycle exhaust. The same sensations she had once shared with Tom, now experienced in a new context with a different family, formed not by blood, but by choice and circumstance. At a rest stop halfway to the memorial site, Jack pulled his bike alongside hers. They sat for a moment in companionable silence, watching the desert horizon shimmer with heat. "Tom would be proud of you," Jack said finally, his voice carrying over the cooling engines. "Of Katie, too." Maggie considered this the simple statement, carrying complex implications. "I think he would. I hope so. But more importantly, I'm proud of us. Of the life we've built after losing him. Of the way we've honored his memory without being defined by his absence." Jack nodded, understanding evident in his gaze. That's the thing about second chances. They're never what you expect, never a straight return to what was lost. Always something new, something you couldn't have imagined. The wisdom in his words resonated with Maggie's own experience of the past year, the unexpected ways her life had expanded and deepened since that fateful morning in the Desert Rose Diner. "Ready to ride," Ben called from his bike, the younger Harrington impatient to continue. Jack grinned, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Always." As they prepared to return to the highway, Jack touched Maggie's arm lightly, his expression turning serious. "Tom taught me how to live," he said quietly. "How to face death with courage, how to honor commitments, even when it cost everything. But you, Maggie Collins, you taught me why to keep living, and that's the greater gift." The simple declaration, delivered without fanfare, settled into Maggie's heart, like a stone dropping into still water, ripples of recognition expanding outward. She nodded, words unnecessary between them. They mounted their motorcycles' engines, igniting with a synchronized roar. The Iron Legion formed up around them, a protective convoy escorting them forward. Not back to what had been lost, but onward to what could still be found. Second chances. Unexpected connections. New beginnings. The highway stretched before them, silver in the Arizona sun, a promise and an invitation all at once. Maggie Collins, once a waitress defined by loss, now a woman reclaiming her full identity, leaned into the first curve with confidence. The past rode with her, acknowledged but no longer constraining. The future beckoned unknown, but faced with courage. And the present moment, this perfect synthesis of speed and balance, of solitude and community, was exactly where she needed to be.